But now we're going to talk from the London vision. We're going to talk about the London recipe, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome our next keynote speaker, and that's Charlie Leadbeater. I've known Charlie for many years. He never fails to deliver on new ideas around innovation. He's an author, thinker, strategic advisor. He works with governments, cities, corporations around the world. He started out, as I did in fact, as a journalist. He held senior editorial positions on the Financial Times and the Independent. He worked in Blair's policy unit at 10 Downing Street. He's ranked by Accenture as one of the top 30 global management thinkers. And he has a new book out called The Frugal Innovator, which analyzes the spread of super low cost, simple and robust and shared solutions to pressing social challenges. So I'm delighted to welcome to Worktech Charlie Leadbeater.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. It's great to be here. Actually, part of my career was spent in Canary Wharf. I remember coming to Canary Wharf where the only shop was the post office. Literally, if you wanted to go out for a bit of retail therapy at lunchtime, stamps were about the only thing. Honestly, I kid you not. And the other thing that I remember very distinctly was that this is where the latte started, because a company called the Seattle Coffee Company had ripped off Starbucks and came here and then had to be bought out by Starbucks. So it was that was the kind of big high point of the day. You could get your latte and then you could go upstairs to in my case, the 18th floor of Canary Wharf, where I had a title on the Independent like Executive Deputy Assistant Editor. And what that will tell you was that I was in charge of chairs, because the more kind of swanky your title gets, the more boring your job gets. And B, that actually as my job got more boring, I got more boring. And so about 20 years ago now, I just decided one evening, having spent 12 hours at work again, just about getting the Independent out with just enough coffee. It was like a kind of just-in-time information processing business, that I would just change and I'd start doing things that interested me. And I just had a very kind of simple set of rules, which were, you won't interest anyone else unless you're interested in it and unless you believe in it. And you won't find interesting things to do unless you make new relationships, and you won't learn unless you make new relationships, and those three things go together. I was fed up of doing jobs where I'd stopped learning. I was working with the same people, doing the same thing over and over again. And so that's what I started doing about 20 years ago, and I'm still just about doing it now. And so what I'm going to talk about is this piece of work actually sponsored by a company called Capco, which is developing Earl's Court and is also the owner of Covent Garden, to look at what makes London successful and to look, I suppose, a little bit behind some of the story that Kit has just told. And just to underline one really exciting bit of that story that Kit mentioned is this remarkable thing that's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years, which is the growth of inner city science. For much of the sort of second half of the 20th century, science became suburban. It was about science parks. If you read the Cambridge Phenomenon report written in the 80s about the growth of science around Cambridge, basically the explanation was scientists like to live in semi-detached houses and drive to work where they can work in labs with very, very large car parks around them. That's why they preferred Cambridge. Actually now it's shifting incredibly fast back towards a kind of inner city kind of science. And that's just one example, that kind of combination of knowledge, systems, infrastructure and culture, which makes, I think, London work. So the way that I understand London, and in fact think about lots of cities, is just through two frames, to make it incredibly simple. And one is systems. Cities have to work with systems. That is part of their definition. You can only do things at scale in cities if you have good systems. Kit talked about developing the kind of machine side of the city, the infrastructure, so on and so forth. So each day in cities, just to get here, everyone in this room will already have unthinkingly relied upon all sorts of systems, energy systems, water systems, information systems, transport systems, you name it. We are kind of systems people. And we only get things done because we can rely on other people to do them for us, and we can then do things at scale. So cities depend on systems, but critically, they also depend on empathy. They critically depend on empathy because cities are a constant negotiation of difference. Actually, what makes cities exciting is the fact that you can meet people who are very different from you and still kind of connect, find common ground, agree to do things. And actually, cities are at their most exciting when people revel in difference rather than run from it. And one of the reasons why London is at the moment becoming more different from the rest of the UK is that in much of England, anyway, there is a kind of tendency to think that difference and otherness is something to be feared rather than celebrated. And I think a sort of definition of a modern Londoner is someone who really revels in difference. They come to the city to enjoy difference, to celebrate it, to exploit it, not to run away from it. And so this combination of systems and empathy, getting that right, is absolutely critical, I think, to workplaces, to schools, to hospitals, and actually to cities. So this is kind of nirvana for anyone who's like me, a kind of sometime management consultant. It's a kind of 2x2, and the sort of wave of relief then kind of floods over you that you know exactly where you are because you can plot yourself on something like this. And my argument is that actually the best cities are up here. They're both highly systematic, they've got really good infrastructure, everything really works, they can be really efficient and low cost as a result, and yet they're also highly empathetic. They deliver great experiences, they're very culturally adept and diverse, and they feel safe and as if people can really connect with one another. And the future of London will all be about whether this recipe, this combination can be maintained. And of course, the best example of that was the Olympics. The best, most recent example of that in many ways was the Olympics. And what was surprising about the Olympics for us, for Londoners, for British people, was that everything worked. It was kind of like we surprised ourselves. I mean, first of all, we kind of really scared ourselves with all that, you must get out of the city, it will be gridlock, and so on and so forth. But then, actually, thanks to the incredible team who led it, everything worked. I remember leaving the Paralympics one evening and getting into the queue to go to the train and thinking, okay, it's been fine so far, it's been brilliant, this is going to take an hour just to get on the train. Actually, it took 10 minutes, and 10 minutes later, we were at Highbury and Islington and getting off. So we kind of surprised ourselves that it actually worked. But actually, the real success was, of course, a lot to do with this lot, this kind of army of kind of empathetic kind of ambassadors for the city. And it was this combination that it worked at a systems level, but it also created this fantastic sense of kind of collective empathy, of kind of celebration, of kind of conviviality. It was that combination that made the Olympics a success. And it's that combination that the city needs to provide over and over again in many, many different ways, not just around events, but in many different places, and for people at different levels of income and where they live, critically. So, the hardest places to live, the most difficult places to be brought up, are down here. And often the lack of systems, private systems and public systems, the lack of systems to rely upon goes with a loss of empathy, trust, and social cohesion. So actually, if you grew up in Lagos, this might feel both empathetic and quite systematic. I mean, there's probably more system and more empathy here than you and I would recognize, but if you dropped any of us into this, it would feel really quite tough. Lagos is the only place in the world where I've arrived to be met by someone at the end of the jetway to take me through immigration in case something awful happened in the course of the journey from the jetway to immigration. It's a slightly scary place. Different sense, Detroit collapsing in on itself, no longer able to afford the systems that it once had, is a different version of that. And then London was like this very much in the 17th century, the 16th and 17th century. It was a kind of absolutely amazing but brutal and ugly place where you got more of virtually everything. In the Gordon riots, which lasted for about 2 weeks, more London property was destroyed than the entirety of the French Revolution, and no big political idea came out of it. There was no sort of big legacy of the Gordon riots. It was just sheer mayhem in a way. So London was like this, and actually the success then in the 18th and 19th century was the introduction of all sorts of city systems for water transport and utilities and other things, which created a more orderly city which could grow. And then I suppose in bits of the post-war legacy of kind of the formalism of modernism and what have you, you get places a bit like this, which are too much system, no empathy. They're kind of, and actually they start kind of falling to bits through that lack of kind of investment. And this, I suppose, the riots now forgotten just before the Olympics, this is a kind of no system to rely upon, the police nowhere, everything seems to be collapsing and no empathy, and they kind of go together. The really interesting bit about this picture is what that bloke with those chinos is doing. Is he simply waiting in line till everyone else has cleared out this Carhartt shop, or is he in fact a journalist or what have you? But actually one of the biggest challenges, I think, of modern cities, and certainly this city, is a much, much less obvious challenge, which is loneliness. Actually, I think the biggest challenge of this city is loneliness. It's isolated people who have absolutely no part in the life of the city, who are cut off and often old, and get forgotten too easily in the kind of stories that we tell about the amazing growth and youth of the city and its exuberance and all the rest of it. Actually, the hidden crisis of London, I think, is a growing tide of isolation, especially amongst older people on very limited incomes. And London, for them, can feel quite an alienating and difficult place. And actually, the solution for them isn't systems so much as empathy. It's their lack of kind of social connection. So much of life in cities, I think, is about finding a balance between systems that can help you with transactions, that can get you from A to B, that can get things done which are very utilitarian, probably quantified, and empathy, which gives you a sense of social connection and meaning. And getting that balance right is absolutely critical. So London is a system city. Actually, interestingly, where we are now, in a way, is one expression, isn't it, of a system city. I mean, actually, if you were to build this again, you might do this differently here, I think. And interestingly, the owners of Canary Wharf are now talking about introducing into the further stages of development all sorts of social aspects of the development which would soften its edges, I suppose. And we've seen important investments in new aspects of systems, particularly around transport. If you compare London and New York, one of the areas where London completely scores is over infrastructure and transport. New York is still feels creaky and unable really to sustain its growth in terms of infrastructure and transport, whereas London, I think, does much better. It's just about, in other words, I think London's got this kind of knack of being just about there. It's not like an Asian city where you might have kind of state-of-the-art systems. It just about manages to cope with its growth and just about manages to keep ahead. And I think actually the work that Transport for London has done, David Hendy, has been really impressive over the last few years to make that possible. And I think actually public transport is probably the most important democratic institution in London. It's more important to me than the GLA. It's more important for democratic access to the city than virtually any other institution in the city. So what's the future of all of that? I think that London needs not just more systems, bigger systems, not just the investment that Kit was talking about in Crossrail and Crossrail 2, in systems for housing and so on and so forth, but we'll need better and different systems. And the key to that is that the systems of the future will be socially intelligent. They'll have a kind of social intelligence built into them. They won't just be industrial processing systems. There'll be systems that work with people to achieve better outcomes, often using quite distributed resources in new kinds of ways. Because the challenge for London is not just how you create new systems. That's a bit of the challenge. The challenge is how you transform, change, modify and adapt existing systems. That's the real challenge. Because in a city this old and embedded, the challenge is not about creating things from a blank slate. It's about remaking things that exist. So interestingly, London is creating a kind of system where there wasn't one before for cycling. And that's going to be an important part of the future of the city. This combination, better public transport and better sharing of private resources, or the creation of new shared resources in the form of car sharing, is going to be an important part of it. If you think about the future of the car just for a moment, and just think about 10 years' time when you could have the next, maybe second, third generation of Tesla electric cars, you could have extensive car sharing. You could have Uber and its new generations. You could have forms of Google cars. And you've got a generation of people who've grown up with social media technology who think cars are really rather stupid and costly, because actually 85% of the time they sit in garages doing nothing but costing both the owner but also the city, because it's taking up valuable space. And then if you turn over all of that parking space to affordable housing, you can see how you could transform one system and help another system all at the same time. And the real challenge for London is not to build more roads or anything like that. It's to completely rethink the use of cars, what they stand for, and what transport systems in cities stand for. The same challenge in recycling and waste. One of the things that Kit didn't mention is London's last landfill site will close in 2018. Actually, there's no future for this city as a city that does landfill. It's got to be a huge recycling city, and that's got to be absolutely mainstream to it. One of the biggest challenges around the world for cities is water and the usage of water, where the recycling and reuse of water is going to be critical. And then health. I mean, actually, alongside financial services, digital media, kind of hospitality, this life sciences thing. Actually, one of the things that London is known for is hospitals. All cities are known for hospitals. They're places where hospitals grew, and this is Guy's and Tommy's. It's absolutely historic, and it's got this huge, great building, but this is not the future of healthcare. The future of healthcare is going to be about prevention of long-term conditions and diseases, their management at the point where people feel that, in localities with them rather than delivering to them. But again, if you just think for a moment about the challenge of Guy's and Thomas's, how many nurses do you think they employ? How many of those nurses are going to be able to afford anywhere to live near that hospital? In 5 years' time, virtually every nurse employed at Guy's and Thomas's is going to have to travel at least an hour and a half each way to get to work. So in other words, for Guy's and Thomas's to be sustainable in future, Guy's and Thomas's will have to become a property developer. And actually we'll need new people entering the system of building low-cost housing and affordable housing in new kinds of ways. That's one challenge, but the challenge of health is to move from this to something more like this. And so this is the creation of a completely different sense of what a health system for a city might be like, which is local, active, communal, participative, preventative. And if then you layer on top of that more of the kind of technologies that are rapidly becoming available and usable, importantly, not just available but usable, then you could imagine a city that is both smart and social. One of the things that I am really sure of is that there is no future for London or personally any other city as a smart city. I would ban the word smart as opposed to cities. I would call them hospitable, sociable, friendly, communal, collective, convivial, but I would not call them smart. Because actually there's something really rather cold about the whole idea of smart cities. What London needs to be is a city that is smart by being social and by amplifying the social aspects of that intelligence rather than the technological aspects. And so it's probably going to be rather simple things that will do that, not huge great systems, but simple development of apps and other civic technologies that people will be able to use to solve problems. And again, if you look at the way that Transport for London has opened itself up to a community of third-party developers, that I think is a really interesting model for other kinds of areas, including the health system in the city. So London needs better systems. It's going to need to invest heavily, but it's also going to need to invest intelligently and creatively in not just more, but better and different, and creating, I think, these socially intelligent systems. But the other aspect of the city, which really matters, and it matters both on grounds of quality of life, but also on grounds of equity, as I'll explain, and critically also economic development, is to think about the more relational aspects of the city. That actually what makes London such a fantastically exciting, friendly, convivial, open, exciting place is the culture of the people who inhabit it and the way that they come together. And often that takes place in smaller spaces which are less regulated and more open. I mean, actually, interestingly, listening to Kit talk and then thinking about Tech City and Med City, I mean, it's slightly kind of, he's now gone, so it's sort of slightly unfair to say this, but of course, if the government of London had declared Tech City 15 years ago, it would never have happened. It only happened actually because the government didn't do that. It happened because artists swarmed around the Whitechapel and Curtin Road, and SCP set up, and there was a kind of Blue Note Jazz Club in Hoxton Square, and then Digit set up, and it was one of the first kind of wave of kind of dot-com bubble companies, and then out of a whole mass of things, that cluster emerged, and then they called it Tech City. And I hate Tech City. I hate the name Tech City. I think it's a kind of invention. I much prefer Silicon Roundabout or the Hoxton Shoreditch cluster or whatever you want to call it. But Tech City is a kind of invention of policy rather than culture, it seems to me. And it's very, very important then to think the kind of leadership that Kit was talking about, that maybe it's better that actually he's only got £200 million. Because actually, no, but seriously, because then he has to use it really cleverly and he has to leverage it with other people to create things rather than creating huge, great things which become inflexible. So a really interesting challenge, which Kit mentioned, which is going to be worth keeping an eye on, is the development of King's Cross. Because Argent, I think, have done a really exemplary job with King's Cross. I think it's a fantastically intelligent, clever development, both in its architecture, in its tenants, in the way that they combine, and I've got a couple of slides about it. But the creation of the Crick Institute is a really big bet on big science at a time when science in a lot of other places is becoming a lot smaller and more sort of convivial. So how you build big things and small things together to create this relational system is a critical challenge. And one of the dangers is in the rush to growth, we forget the small. We forget the critical importance of small spaces and small interventions to create really large amounts of value. And that's because this kind of empathy that you create when people come together is like a kind of dark matter. It has to be there. The ability to, in a city, see someone, recognize their difference, but overcome it, and recognize that you share something with them, even if it's only a bus, or a meal, or a space, or passing remark. That kind of empathy, that widespread conviviality is absolutely essential to cities. And it comes sometimes out of chance, out of crisis, out of adversity. There is a long history and sort of mythology in this city about the empathy of the Blitz, about the welcoming of immigrants, of Huguenots and others. And you saw it, of course, after the riots with this kind of activity that people talked about a lot, that this was kind of uplifting and a kind of, a kind of reassertion of the kind of civic pride of London. You see it here. I mean, these people are being kept back by that man in the orange jacket and that gate, but they're also being held in place by a kind of stoic empathy, which kind of commuters are used to kind of exhibiting with one another. It's a kind of, there is a sort of dark matter there, a social dark matter, which is holding those people in that kind of really sullen and angry kind of state. But the more interesting thing is how you can design for empathy, how you can design cities and spaces so you make it more likely that different people come to them and connect. And there, of course, there's lots to draw on, which is not new, from the work of Jan Gehl and from William White and urban small spaces and so on and so forth. But you see a lot of it in London doing really well. So you see it in parks. One of the things that I found as I went around doing this London recipe thing is, of course, William White's point, small spaces where people can sit really matter. Sitting really matters. Where people can sit and talk and kind of gather really matters. We found a lot of support, interestingly, for small investments in playful public spaces. So I think there are lots of table tennis tables now outside in London and lots of those outdoor gyms. I don't see a lot of people using the outdoor gyms, I must admit, but when we asked people what they liked about London, outdoor gyms was one of the things they spontaneously mentioned as a kind of investment in a small packet of resources that meant a bit to them. Food is absolutely critical. I think actually one of the things that's transformed London is a wave of food entrepreneurship over the last 10 years, which has got no governmental kind of role in it whatsoever, but has created a kind of entire swathe of convivial spaces. And this is my favourite market in London, Whitecross Street Market. It's one of the best food markets in London. It's thronged with people every lunchtime, and it's a kind of living kind of example of the diversity and conviviality of the city. This is the steps down to the canal from the Central St Martin building and Granary Square at Argent's development at King's Cross. It's absolutely fantastically well designed, so it can be used in this kind of very informal, relaxed kind of way. So designing for empathy is, I think, about respecting the value of smallness, the importance of conviviality, the critical importance of attracting women and families. If you can make spaces friendly for women and families, then it becomes safe for everyone, and they attract more women, more men, and in general. They have to have comfortable, easy, convivial places to sit. And I think London needs to and is peppered by objects of public love, things that people feel attached to that are public, not private, public, but not monumental. So actually, one of the things that I still love and wish really existed was the banquette seat on a route master. Kind of the new route master's got a sort of certain version. I will wait till one of those buses comes along to sit on one of those seats. I loved the taping round the handle as you went up the stair. I loved the curve of the stair. So actually, all of that is about creating objects of public love. I think London is rich in objects of public love and actually needs more of them. It needs to celebrate and promote them. And then, of course, there's lots around food, cultural animation, and social norm setting. Not that I think you need people in bowler hats everywhere, and that might only work in certain parts of the city, but actually you need to take care about who's animating public spaces, because you can't just assume that it's going to kind of emerge from nowhere. London's not alone in this. There are all sorts of other cities that do it really well and all sorts of other spaces. I'll just give you 2 examples. One is this. This, I think, is a brilliant piece of urban technology. It's a chair. And it's a chair that actually the design of which was borrowed from the Tuileries Gardens in Paris, but now is the basic technology of Bryant Park in New York. And Bryant Park, I think, is one of the model public spaces where you get this combination of systems and empathy. Because you find these chairs, rather than having beautifully designed architectural benches, which are inflexible, actually you get these chairs, and then what you see people using them and combining them in all sorts of ways to assemble their own solutions, and they leave a kind of social shadow of themselves, of where they've been, and then they can kind of pack them up. And of course here you've got a reading room in a park which is both a library, and there's chess games you can see, and so on and so forth. This, I think, is a really good example of a sort of system. It's a system for sitting this. It's kind of stacked together. It's modular. It's repeatable, standardizable, all the rest of it. It's got all the characteristics of a system, but it allows a very high degree of relationality and kind of empathy. There's a Portland, Oregon, I think, does it really well. One of the interesting things that started the renaissance of Portland was small-scale public art, giving people the power to redesign intersections and take them over. I would love to see something more like that in London, where we could encourage a creative kind of community-level public art which gave people a sense of real ownership over spaces. And that, I think, was critical to Portland's renaissance. But then also in Korea, this is a river through the middle of Seoul, which was a kind of like a sewer. And then the mayor of Seoul redeveloped it, but redeveloped it in a really intelligent way. And Seoul is going to be a really interesting place to watch, because the mayor of Seoul is a social entrepreneur, Mr. Park, who set up the Hope Institute, inspired by Oxfam. If you see people on the tube wearing baby on board badges, they come from Seoul. That was his invention. One of his other great inventions was the variable height hanger on the Seoul subway, so smaller people could get longer hangers. I mean, it's kind of very, very practical and also very strategic, but it's kind of evidenced in this walk which you can do through the centre of Seoul. And it's just a creation of kind of space that's both efficient, roads run alongside it, and for people walking and commuting, but also highly social. And it creates a kind of space for sort of empathy in the centre of the city, which has a kind of effect beyond itself, which is very, very large. And so it's both playful, good Lord, here we are crossing the river on stepping stones without any safety requirements whatsoever. How remarkable. And you get a scene like this in the middle of Seoul, one of the high-tech cities of the world. So I think those are examples. So London has lots that it could learn from other places, but it has enormous strengths in this kind of area. So that I think is the London recipe. It's got to be a high system, socially intelligent, creative systems, not just kind of quantitative systems that bring out this capacity for empathy. And when you're in that space, that's not just a good place to live, that's a really thriving economy as well. Because talent, ideas, creativity are drawn to places that can provide that kind of combination. I'm not going to say a lot about what lies behind it, but let me just say 2 things. One is that there is a vital underpinning kind of politics to it in London. And it's that London is a peculiar kind of state. So Kit compared London to Austria. Austria has a government. The London state is a weird thing. And the reason London's successful is that it's got a weird state. And this weird state in London is that it's a mixture of national and European borough and this kind of pretty weak mayor, basically. A new invention, but basically rather weak, compared to Mike Bloomberg or to Rahm Emanuel, quite weak, actually. Compared even to Richard Lees and Howard Bernstein in Manchester, quite weak. So as a result, you've got this patchwork state which has just enough of a centre to hold, but quite a lot of diversity between the boroughs, and a self-governing citizenship. And I think the most important political innovation in London is not the mayoralty, it's the creation of a self-governing citizenship. That basically, most of the time, we're on our own. Basically, it's up to us. We've got to govern the city together, and we've got to find ways to do it. And the point of the political system is to allow that to thrive. So that does take a kind of peculiar kind of political leadership. And he has done it brilliantly in ways. He is, and Kit's right that Boris sums up the sort of self-confidence of the city. The city has become more self-confident in part because it's got this incredibly self-confident mayor who can both be incredibly funny and down to earth and cycle around and conduct focus groups at traffic lights and yet also play on a global stage. I mean, he's been absolutely fantastic. But actually, a lot of the governance of London might live here in the boroughs, or probably even more here, or probably even more here. I mean, actually, it's the combination of those two things that really matters, that kind of sense of diversity, which might provide you with the conviviality, the difference, the smallness, with the ability to see the whole. And so the future of London, I think, is, we are in a purple patch. It's got incredible opportunities. It's got money flooding into it. It's got people who want to come to it. It's got an amazing culture. It's got systems that just about work. It's got able property developers. It's got lots and lots of things going for it. But there is a big challenge. And the big challenge is that it will eat itself, basically. That London's success will be its own failing. Because actually, what's happening is if you earn between 20 and 35,000 pounds, say, or upwards of that, 40, maybe up to 55,000 pounds, if you're a household income of that and a couple, actually it's really, really hard, this city. It's dynamic, it's attractive, you want to be here, this is where the work is, but it's really, really tough. And actually, there are too many people in this bracket doing jobs which are absolutely vital to the city. The city cannot work without them. They're teachers, they're teaching assistants, they're nurses, they're retail assistants, they're office administrators, they're electricians, and actually living in London is tough, really tough, and it's getting tougher because they're in a labour market which is hugely competitive and which is depressing their wages, which has got new entrants from immigrants and graduates and migrants from within the UK, and they face a property market which is completely dysfunctional and which keeps them out and which seems further and further away from them, and they face utility and other costs which are very, very difficult to shoulder. So as London has become successful, it's also become much tougher. And the really big challenge, I think, for London is how to get this combination of systems of empathy which works for everyone, which works not just in Shoreditch and in Earl's Court and Covent Garden and King's Cross, but works in Hendon and works in Havering and works in Croydon, and that will increasingly have to spread out as the city itself spreads out beyond. Meanwhile, the other thing that I think then, the other side of that story that really threatens the city is that wealth threatens it. Because wealth threatens to deaden it. Because actually, if you get places which are just full of rich people who only come and go, then actually the social life of the city will kind of come out of it. And I think part of what's happening to the centre of the city is that it risks that. It risks becoming a bit like Dubai on Thames, basically. Because you can find the same people shopping in the same shops, eating the same food, and going off then to the same places. And it looks more like other places than it used to, it seems to me. And the real challenge about big buildings and new developments and all of that in London, it seems to me, is not the skyline, it's the social line. What really matters is whether these places create vibrant places at the street level, not what they do at the eye level. And that is part of the worry. So I think the big challenge for London is now not just to grow. I think that was the challenge. If you look back The challenge, as Kit said 15 years ago, was will this city grow? And we've got a recipe for growth now. It's about talent, investment, ideas, all agglomerating and building. It's a version of the Richard Florida recipe, and we know that that can work. But we know it also now comes with a heavy toll of inequality and pressure on the middle class. So the big agenda for cities of the future and for the next mayor, whoever that may be, is not just a revel in growth, but to make growth work for everyone, to create a kind of model of fair growth in London. That's the big challenge. And that will require both new systems to make life affordable, but also investment to make life livable for people on very modest incomes. That, I think, will be the key political test for London over the next 10 years. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Charlie. High empathy, high system presentation, and really going behind the headlines that Kit presented at the top of this event, really delving into some of the ways in which London can move forward, fair growth, not just a smart city, but a sociable and convivial city. So we've time for some questions. Yeah, so if you could, lady there, so if you could, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions in a cluster and then get Charlie to feed back.
Yes, Sophie Bollier from the British Council. I really enjoyed the presentation, and those are essential points. I was just wondering why the environmental consciousness is not higher in the presentation. I think I appreciate it was presented at some point, not really mentioned by Kate, but and you, for example, mentioned the example of Korea, which for me is a place where environmental consciousness is very high, and I can't see how a city can be an example and successful if we don't bring this higher in the order.
Okay, yeah. Park that thought.
All right.
Second question. Okay. Yeah, gentleman there.
Neil Gorman from Cushing Wakefield. This is sort of an observation, really, because I thought that the whole sort of speech was fascinating. But I think if you replace the London with workspace, then so many of the things which Charles was talking about apply just as well to the workspace, about food, about people, about empathy, social cohesion. And I think it's just fascinating to see the similarities.
Absolutely. Yeah, gentleman at the back there. And then we'll go to Charlie.
With regard to systems, what happens when the machine stops?
Okay. When the systems break down. Okay, so environmental consciousness links with the workspace, and what happens when the machine stops?
Just on the workspace thing, absolutely. So I would just sort of take that little grid away and then apply it to any set of experiences you wanted to. I mean, actually, good restaurants are systems and empathy. You need systems. You get frustrated when the systems don't work and the food doesn't arrive and so on and so forth. But actually, that's not fundamentally what they're there for. They're there to create a place in which you can have a convivial conversation and meal with someone else. They're about that. So schools, I think, are like that. I mean, the best schools are places which are highly systematic in ways. They're very methodical, but they're highly relational. And as you say, workspaces are definitely like that. And of course, what you see in a place like this is that it's heavy on system and not strong enough on empathy, basically, this kind of development, and it needs to kind of redevelop that and kind of find ways of kind of pulling it in. And you find lots of, I think, rather inauthentic places which try to generate that, but they're overdone. So I think there's a bit which is all this empathy stuff, which is about allowing people to make it themselves rather than kind of doing it, over-designing it, over-polishing it, so on and so forth. So absolutely. But it will be interesting. I mean, Google is a very interesting company. I know you probably all know this, don't you, that Google's done this work to analyse the appropriate length of a queue in a canteen to maximise efficient flow and chances of serendipitous conversations. And with big data and stuff, you could imagine all sorts of versions of that story playing out. On the environment, I completely agree. And actually, this is a kind of bit of a get out, but if you read, I've got a second report called The Hollow Promise, which is about living on £20,000 to £40,000 in London. And one of the things that I recommend to London there is that it learned from Freiburg in Germany. Because Freiburg, if you want a model of a city which has made living livable, modern by being green, it's an absolutely perfect example. And so just in terms of housing, they've got these amazing developments, these two kind of brownfield developments in Freiburg, and they're publicly financed to take the risk out, privately developed by groups of residents getting together to design their own kind of 3- and 4-story apartment blocks with passive energy systems and a combination of all their sort of solar stuff. The cheapest energy bill in an apartment in Vauban is €50 a year. €50 a year. That is an innovation that people want. You know, if you're talking about finding a way to make life livable for people in London on modest incomes, that is one of them. And so I think there's a combination of kind of more radical and more affordable solutions, which once might have seemed a bit kind of alternative, actually become common sense now. So I think that's the future of the sharing economy as well in London, kind of sharing economy. The work I did with those groups, they were all avid users of shared services in some shape or form. So I think that it's an absolutely vital part of it. And I apologise if I downplayed it. And then in terms of breakdown, well, one of the interesting, I suppose it's partly a question of, what kind of breakdown or what kind of stop comes. One of the interesting things about this city is now its ability to withstand its own failures or to withstand its own crises, because people find routes around and ways, and that's one of the strengths of empathy, that actually you can withstand something not working for 2, 3, 4 days, because actually you can find ways to get together to get around it, and it's quite adaptable. A bigger challenge is what if actually the systems that we've got for building homes and creating communities and linking them to transport and jobs are just not good enough. Then I think that's a much bigger problem, because then you get into the heart of what works in London in terms of government and what kind of agency you need to sort those problems out. So, and I think we're just about to find that out, basically. I think the next stage of London's development will require new, more effective, more ambitious forms of public and shared agency to sort out some of those problems around housing, skills, jobs, transport, so on and so forth.
Okay, time for a couple more questions. Yeah, gentleman there in the red. If you could let us know who you are and where you're from.
Martin Barber-Edmore from the TSK Group. I just wonder what your thought is in where London is with regard to, say, comparison with New York, for instance, where if you look at New York, the vast majority of people have now done exactly what you said, which has been pushed out to the centre, unaffordable, can't live there. The systems are obviously creaking, to use your expression as such, but the migration from the suburbs, which has then unfortunately ghettoised a lot of those suburbs as well. So it's actually, you know, to a large extent, is that behind the curve? Is that where we're potentially heading? And how would we mitigate eventually becoming like that?
Well, I think in ways, New York, thankfully, is kind of ahead of us in some ways, and so a warning about that. And so the de Blasio kind of wave in response to the Bloomberg administration, I think, was an amazing administration. It did incredible things, and it had a really impressive team of people. I think Bloomberg is one of the most impressive banks in the world, but that dynamic of inequality has been really, really powerful. And the reaction to it is a de Blasio administration for whom now housing is absolutely central to doing that. And it will require much more active shaping of the market, is the lesson of that, to work with developers, to bring on land. And I think in London, we are only going to get a handle on that if I think many of the innovations to build more attractive, lower cost, both rented and owned accommodation are there. I don't think there's a problem personally on the innovation side in the supply. I think it's all about land prices, basically. And London needs some sort of public land bank, basically, to manage that economy so it can create affordable, decent places to live for people on modest incomes. Otherwise, it will inevitably suffer versions of that kind of thing. Having said that, you will, of course, out of that get a mixture of things which you won't be able to predict. So actually, a lot of creativity will spread out to a sort of outer ring beyond the central circle line and beyond. And that may have really important consequences for the city, which could be beneficial as well. So, but what we won't tackle those problems by just feeling good about ourselves, basically. We need something more ambitious than that to be able to do that. But it needs to be a sort of socially intelligent ambition, not just build rabbit hutches, basically.
On that note of socially ambitious, socially intelligent ambition, I just want to say thank you very much to Charlie. We set the bar high with Worktech keynotes, but Charlie has risen to the occasion. A fascinating discourse on the future of London. Charlie Leadbeater, thank you very much.